Next up, a deep dive on how digital technology is shaping the future of infrastructure. We'll hear from public and private sector experts about how data, cloud services, and innovations in technology are changing the way we do business and provide services to citizens. Please welcome on stage Brian Palish, Managing Director, Government Relations and Infrastructure Initiatives at the American Society of Civil Engineers, David Wilson, Chief Innovation Officer at Bechtel, Bob Bennett, Chief Innovation Officer for Kansas City, Missouri, and Franco Amalfi, Director of the Strategic Government Programs at Oracle Public Sector North America. The Hill staff writer Melanie Zanona will be leading this conversation. Melanie, over to you.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. We have a great panel here today, and we will be allowing some time for questions, so keep those in mind. But I want to start with our panel here today talking about digital infrastructure, because we hear at the federal level so much about concrete and steel and not so much about concrete and sensors. But we're really seeing smart cities starting to ride this digital wave and digitalizing their infrastructure. So let me start by opening up to the panel and just ask, how would you define smart infrastructure, and how can it really benefit or transform the United States?
We'll go to the end, okay. So I think smart infrastructure has a lot of different roles. It can be sensors in the road to adjust signals to move traffic better so we can get more throughput in the system. We've seen some of our members use sensors on bridges to better understand the loads and stresses on a bridge so that they can identify problems sooner to make repairs and improve that. We see sensors in water systems. I think the District of Columbia has sensors in their water main system so they can see if there's problems and they can repair or replace the water main before it breaks, which is nice, so the street does not flood. So things like that.
Bob, Kansas City, what are you guys doing?
In Kansas City right now, we have the smartest 54 blocks in the entire United States. They're located somewhere between the riverfront and down south to Union Station. Everything is censored in that particular space. We have water sensors, which do the acoustic monitoring to help us figure out where the next leak is going to be, so we do maintenance instead of repairs. We do traffic monitoring, we do pedestrian monitoring, so we can influence our economic development efforts. And then we've got an analysis platform on top of that, which actually helps us to synchronize city operations.
David, how is Bechtel using big data to address this issue?
So for us, you hear a lot about big data, and there's a lot of talk about it. It's if you listen to the industry, it's an easy button. It's actually really hard. And I think the root of it is, how do you connect the right resources to the right people at the right place at the right time, which is the fundamental of execution for any project or city. Big data then offers the ability to do that predictively and on demand, but you have to go through the hard work of understanding the data and curating the data in a meaningful fashion. I think some of the things that cities are doing now, where they're digitizing and then opening the data up to the public, actually is creating new business opportunities, because you're able to understand the data to then drive new markets, new sectors that didn't exist before. So we're using big data to drive productivity in the industry, which should result in more projects, but it also has a life cycle benefit for cities that build in the sensors and then harness the big data like Kansas City has done.
What about the cloud, Franco? How can that be used?
I believe the cloud has a significant role to play in smart infrastructure. I mean, if you think of it, in your phone today, you have more processing power than we've ever had in data centers in the past. The cloud provides us those capabilities, and I think talking about smart infrastructure, we view smart infrastructure connecting the physical world with the digital world, wearables, smartphones, and so on. So how do we take all this data and create and tie it to systems and processes to create a better experience for citizens? And cloud plays a critical role in making that happen.
Is this something that can only be used in urban settings, or are rural areas using this as well?
I mean, I know I'll take a stab at it. In definitely urban centers is a key area, but I think also in rural areas, we are seeing a lot of investments. A lot of cities and a lot of small areas are trying to, the digital divide came up before and a lot of bandwidth in certain parts. So I think it's designing your processes and designing your capabilities in a way that you can do this in a lower bandwidth. I mean, we're talking to some municipalities where they're looking at artificial intelligence, virtual assistants as a way of delivering citizen services, because that is provides a lower bandwidth capabilities, reducing the HTML, the pictures on the web pages, and so on. I think it's important to think of all the different groups when you're designing your capabilities. Obviously, cities have more capabilities, but if you go to rural areas, it is still an important area. We need to think inclusively and include them as well.
I know in our case that we've got 318 square miles of city, and in that place, there are a lot of it that are incredibly lightly populated in terms of density. There are more cows in southern Kansas City than there are people. And methane is actually the biggest threat to our air quality down there. So
You can censor that.
we could censor that. And in fact, we are censoring, and that's the beautiful thing.
Smart cows.
Well, something like that. But no, the beauty of it is that we are able to test out a lot of different types of censoring. And what we're learning are things that are impacting our traffic flow. They're impacting our ability to better link those rural parts of our city with the more connected urban core. To the point now we're starting to launch a smart region initiative where we're bringing in our suburban communities to start sharing data with us so they can benefit from it as well.
Brian, tell me a little bit about ASC's partnership with Smart City Works and how that has brought innovative technologies and civil engineering projects to the market.
So it's a relatively new partnership. I think it's been around for about a year, and I think what we're trying to do is marry up some of their ideas with some of our members and really try to push this innovation. You know, we talk a lot. We have a report card that's available to everyone. We have this $2 trillion gap in infrastructure investment. And while, you know, I share the senator's pessimism a little bit about how we're going to do an infrastructure bill, the reality here is we can innovate our way out of some of that $2 trillion. And so by partnering with folks like Smart City Works and others to try and innovate some of these ideas to be replacing infrastructure at the right time, before we have larger problems is some of the stuff that I think will help and allow us to get to some of that $2 trillion, but we still need some actual real investment in capital.
What about the smart grid? How is that powering smart cities? How easy is it to update that system in America's electric grid?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that just to an extent. So, you know, with the smart grid, you're able to obviously optimize it for power consumption. I think it's interesting. The thing that we start to think a lot about, talk a lot about, is the convergence of smart and the convergence of green and accessible and transformative to create resilient. And I think that smart grid gets into that space where you have resilient, and how do you know, it's more than smart. Smart is an enabling mechanism of resilient cities. So you talk about the Virgin Islands, you talk about, you know, even for, I'm in Houston, right? So how do you progressively use technology and infrastructure and the digitization of that to create resilient cities so that they can overcome natural events? And I think getting into the smart grid, allowing you to, you know, optimize it and reroute and connect it, gets you closer to that end of the spectrum.
Is the technology here yet? Is it available, or are we still seeing developments on this front?
Well, I guess I don't think the development ever stops, right? So I think the thing that I see from our seat is, and it came up earlier about the 5-year infrastructure investment. 5 years is too long for an investment because technology will change in 18 months. And we look at that from an execution standpoint. You get about an 18-month life cycle on technology before you have to upgrade. I think an interesting thing for both the industry to tackle collectively is interoperability and upgrades that can be driven more by software upgrades as opposed to hardware upgrades. So how do you build a city or a bridge or a road with enough planned future use and upgrades that you can upgrade it with software, or you can upgrade it with chips and code, as opposed to having to go back out and do the physical upgrading. So I think there's something around how do we create adaptive cities that can grow as technology continues to pace, because Moore's Law isn't stopping, and it actually is applying to more things than just processing power. And I think it's going to take a hard look about planning for that future-proofing and continually future-proofing our infrastructure and our cities.
What would you say are the biggest hurdles for digital infrastructure? Is it the regulatory piece of it? Are there laws on the books that need to be changed? Are there new laws that need to be created to help spur this sort of rebuilding across America? What would you say are the biggest hurdles here?
I think with a lot of this kind of infrastructure, there's a fear factor a little bit from probably a local government standpoint, although Kansas City, you guys are leading the way. But folks don't want to share all their data. I mean, we now have our phones on all the time, and those phones are sharing data, right? But then when people start thinking about that, they get a little fearful of that, and maybe rightly so. But I think that's part of it. I think, frankly, I think that there needs to be some sort of incentive for folks to adopt new technology. We've found with whether it's new materials or new ways, new processes, sometimes any level of government can sort of slow that down because, well, we haven't done it that way before. And at some point, we're going to have to start trying to do some of those things this way to innovate ourselves out of some of this problem. I think of autonomous vehicles as, we've got hundreds of thousands of miles of road. They are as ready as they're going to be for autonomous vehicles. They're probably not going to get more ready. In some places they will, but that's stuff that we need to really start thinking about.
We're seeing cities also start looking at modernizing the policies for privacy, and as they do these smart deployments, to be lighting or transportation, they actually are looking at through those policies and looking at the privacy requirements and making sure that they update them for doing these type of projects and making sure the citizens know what is being collected, how it's being used, and how they're going to benefit from it. Because at the end of the day, I think everybody knows that we have to give up some of our privacy in order to be able to have better capabilities. But I think letting people know how you're going to use the data and for what purposes and how they're going to benefit from it is a great step in the right direction.
Bob, was there any resistance in Kansas City from residents or officials? What was the reaction like?
The greatest resistance we actually had was almost from our state politicians, some of our federal. The politicization of innovation is actually probably the biggest impediment to making progress. When we came up with a public-private partnership where the city was absolutely the minority partner to do those 54 blocks, and Cisco and Sprint and several other corporations paid the biggest portion of the bill and actually have the most to gain by it in terms of an actual bottom line for them, there were folks in our local level, at the state level, who didn't want the city to be that far out on the edge. And that is something that it takes a mindset change where the city sees itself as part of the ecosystem and not defining the ecosystem for other entities. Once you make that leap, all of a sudden, things get easier. And we're now considering a way to expand what we're doing from a smart city perspective by about a factor of 20 or so. And we're working through that process right now. And a huge part of that is going to be better integrating our private sector partners.
I want to talk about the financing and funding piece of this. Are these types of projects more expensive at the outset? Can they save taxpayers more money in the long run? You can work in some examples, too, about how this is actually being used in real time, but how are these being financed?
The first phase that we did was about $20 million worth of infrastructure. 16 million of that came from Cisco and Sprint in terms of actually laying out the network. Sprint owns and operates the network, so they are responsible for the maintenance and for the life cycle bits that's been described here that, quite frankly, are a challenge for us as we move forward. $3.8 million came from the city. Some of that was in kind. We're very fortunate in Kansas City to have fiber that we own, that we are able to provide to Sprint for backhaul, which made up $1.4 million to the city's 3.8 contribution to that effort. So we were able to do a lot of things in a short period of time because we had that to negotiate with. As we look to expand, we are looking at city fiber access as a means to defray those costs. We're looking at access to our poles as a means to defray those costs, which we're fortunate enough to own. Other cities, not as much. Birmingham, Alabama, the electric utility owns their poles. And so the utility is actually leading the way for the smartification of that community. So lots of different ways to do it, but you need to look at your city as assets as opposed to looking at your city as a sunk cost. And all of a sudden, again, the aperture opens and you can do new things.
We're also seeing some cities doing revenue sharing models with companies, the private sector. An example was City of San Jose is working with a company called Anycom, where they're building the smart lights, and they can have a revenue sharing model with that company to actually put that in place.
David, Does the incorporation of digital technology increase the long-term value of a project?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I think what we're seeing, and you look at the construction industry, there's about a $1.6 trillion gap in productivity. It's widely known. And you look at how technology can help address that productivity in execution will also lend to the life cycle benefit of the project or the bridge or the city. So what we're deploying to help us solve productivity, the sensors, the connectivity, which we talked about, a lot of us talk about ubiquity of connectivity, but it's not there. So as you go out and build in rural areas and add connectivity for a job site, leaving it there in a sustainable manner can then better the community, which then adds greater value. I think that one of the things we're seeing is technology costs go up, but total project costs should go down, and value for the life cycle of the community should improve.
Yeah, Brian, how can big data help mitigate the life cycle costs of infrastructure?
Well, it's interesting. One of our big ideas or big thoughts that we've had recently is how do we get our arms around that total life cycle cost? So it's not about the first cost of the bridge. It's about what the total cost is to operate it over its life. And what we've found in talking with state legislators, local politicians, no one has a large operations and maintenance budget, right? It's the first thing that gets cut. And so if we can start looking at these projects in their total life cycle, yes, it might cost a little bit more up front, but maybe you lessen that operations cost, returning money to the city or the local government at that point, and allowing for that project to last longer. And so we really feel like using some data that you already have about the city, data that you already have about the infrastructure, allows you to put better infrastructure in place. Or if you're building a new project, maybe you can think about what it's going to be in 50 years rather than what it's going to be in 5 years. Now, admittedly, sometimes it's hard to get politicians to think in those terms. They don't like to put zeros on the end of years, right, because they're looking at 2 or 4 or 6 year terms. But the reality is that infrastructure is going to be there for a long time, and really looking, again, going at that total life cycle cost, not just the first cost, is really what we want folks to do.
How important are public-private partnerships going to be in creating this type of infrastructure? We hear about it all the time in traditional infrastructure. What would it look like with a digital component to it?
So far as digital stuff goes, the public-private partnership is absolutely positively the best way to get it done. And given the fact that any investment we make in a city has to live as long as the bond which supports it. You're not going to do that with digital infrastructure for a 20-year bond. So we have to do it with a public-private partnership in order to meet that 18-month, 36-month life cycle exchange point. And because of that, we're fortunate enough to figure out a way to get that done.
Brian, do you think that the federal government should be in charge of providing incentives to local cities to adopt this sort of technology?
Well, I think as we look towards an infrastructure bill, or we look towards the next surface transportation bill or water resources bill, there are things that we should be doing to incentivize. What exactly that means, I don't know yet. We've been thinking about that. How do we incentivize local governments, state governments to do, again, not only digitizing the infrastructure, if you will, making it more digital, but also looking at that total life cycle cost. I do think that is, you marry those two things together, we'll end up with better projects, whether that's giving folks a plus up to the money that they're getting. I mean, there are ways to do this and ways to incentivize this. Certainly, we continue to say with any of this infrastructure issue that we're looking at, the federal government has to be a better partner in this. And part of it is through a little bit of lessening maybe some regulations or fixing some of those issues. But the reality is the federal government has not come to the table with enough money for about a generation. Of infrastructure building. So it's time for the federal government to step up and spend a little bit more money on infrastructure.
What does the rest of the panel think about the role of the federal government and what they can do to be a better partner? Is it just more money, or are there other things that they can be doing?
So I think one of the things, and this is kind of a subtle thing, but the UK had done a few years ago where they placed a BIM mandate around work. So building information modeling basically means data-centric, pulling data together, operating in a data-centric fashion for the life cycle of a project. The UK government said future projects for the government will adhere to BIM standards as going forward. Pretty easy thing to write down, hard thing to do, but it actually is a good forcing function to drive the data-centric transformation of the execution of the life cycle of a project, which then lends itself better to better data collection, to better application for big data. And I think there are things in that space that can be a forcing function to drive the supply chain relative to infrastructure to digitize in a meaningful manner?
Dr. Sakwu Rhee over at the National Institute for Standards and Technology is already leading a beautiful federal response by convening a lot of the smart city leaders from across the country. And the idea that they can create standards by which we can all play on the same playing field in terms of what data we're going to collect at the macro level, so that industry can come to us with sensors or technologies that apply not just to Kansas City, but also to St. Louis, also to Louisville, also to Birmingham, also to San Diego, also to New York, would be incredibly helpful. The other thing they could do is invest in a lot of these technologies which connect us physically. So when I-70 needs to get updated between Topeka to Kansas City to St. Louis, pretty please put in the fiber that goes along with that and give us access to it. When you're doing the quick rail lines from Chicago all the way down to Dallas, going through Union Station in Kansas City, put in the fiber that goes with that and give us all access to it. The one thing I'd ask the federal government not to do is please don't preempt us. We have folks that come and tell us how much we're allowed to spend, or how much we're allowed to charge vendors to use our poles, how much we're allowed to charge vendors to use the rest of our infrastructure. Please, federal government, get out of my city when it comes to telling us how to run it. We got this. We don't need you to do this.
Franco, I want to ask about how do you connect the physical world with the digital world, to make customers and citizens more satisfied and to drive more efficient cities?
So one of the key things that we are seeing across cities is all these sensors deployments. They're everywhere. They're on roads. They're in buildings. But one of the things that is happening is there's many vendors that are participating, and this data is collected, and it comes at you very fast. So one of the big needs that we are seeing is the need of having an IoT platform. And I was talking to Bob about this before. It's the integration. How do you take this data? It could be at millions of records a second and analyze it and be able to, this fast data, be able to make sense of that data, look at the exceptions, use it, and then take it and pass it to business processes. And those business processes is what drives efficiencies for the citizens. So you really need to look at it holistically. You need to think all the different deployments, have an integration strategy, and really look at it modular. You build in this over time. And you need to think of it as an enterprise architecture. You need to have an IoT platform strategy, an integration strategy, and then any new project you're doing leverages this integration and this platform to provide these capabilities to citizens. Because if you can't build it all at once, and you shouldn't be rebuilding it all the time. I mean, the way in the 90s and 2000s we were looking at middleware, the same approach needs to happen in IoT and integration for citizens.
I want to talk about cybersecurity. How big of a concern is it as we're becoming more digital with our infrastructure? Bob, maybe you can talk about how Kansas City has maybe prepared a contingency plan for if this technology fails or there's an outage. How concerned is the city about attacks or vulnerabilities?
We're very concerned about cybersecurity. Certainly, we mitigate that a couple of different ways. We do as much processing as we can on the edge so that the data which flows across the sensors and into our data management platform is actually collected, anonymized, aggregated at the block level. This way, it helps us to protect the identity of individuals who live in that space, and it allows us to better protect the data as a whole. The second thing we're doing is we do have private sector partners. And when I look at Cisco and realize there are literally 6,000 people on the clock 24 hours a day focusing on cybersecurity, as opposed to the smaller IT department that we have at the city, that gives me a little bit more happiness.
Mm-hmm. David, is Bechtel doing anything to address this issue?
Oh, absolutely. So we have a cybersecurity lab not too far down the road. We have an InfoSec team within Bechtel, and it is a top priority, right? Because there are people looking for any weak link in the execution. So if they can get project data on a facility that we happen to be building, which anything from nuke plants to power plants, that's a concern. So it's not something that I think anybody can ignore if they're involved with a project that affects the public. So yeah, it's a very high priority for us in the organization.
We will be opening up for questions in a few minutes, but before that, I just want to hit on one last point, bring things back to Capitol Hill. Obviously, that's our bread and butter at the Hill. I'm curious, is Congress addressing this in any way right now? Have we seen any lawmakers introduce any bills? Are there any efforts that we've seen underway in the digital infrastructure space?
I know that Representative Delbene and Senator Cantwell from Washington have put forward a smart city thing in committee. We'll see if that comes to any fruition, but based on what we heard this morning, not going to hold my breath.
Well, with an infrastructure package coming up, it does provide an opportunity potentially for lawmakers to address it. What would you want to see in an infrastructure bill?
That any piece of infrastructure that is going to be incentivized at the local or state level from the feds include the word smart in it. Let's not fix a street by just pouring more concrete. That may be an effective way to do it, but it's not the most effective way because that street's going to be here for 30 years. So let's do it right now, and let's lay that groundwork for the future.
Brian, ASE puts out the report card every year. America can't even keep up with traditional infrastructure. Can we expect that America can keep up with digital infrastructure?
Well, I think we're going to need to. I don't think we have a choice. I think it depends on, infrastructure is what we use to manage our daily lives, right? Whether it's the water supply for the morning, we all got up, hopefully had a cup of coffee this morning and bathed and things like that. That's infrastructure, right? We don't want to think about it or know about it. We just want it to work. Hopefully most of us used Waze to get here this morning so we could avoid some traffic problems. So I think that really the infrastructure is simply the backbone of the economy, right? Right now, it's because it doesn't work as well as it should, that costs every one of us money out of our pockets on an annual basis. And so what we want to see is a little bit smarter investment, whether that's using, and if we're going to make that smarter investment, let's make it for the long haul. So doing some of the things that the panelists said here today are absolutely correct. If you're going to rebuild the street, put the right sensors in it so we can make better decisions later. We need to build infrastructure for the future, for the next 50 years, not for the last 20. I think that's, if there's a general comment I would make, that's what I would say.
Okay, great. Well, we would like to open up for questions. Please identify yourself. We have a microphone coming around.
So Larry Schaefer, Schaefer Global. You talked about a mitigation plan for cybersecurity. How about for EMP threats? The InfraGard group has been doing a lot of work on discussing the EMP threat. Is there a mitigation plan? What's the balance of funding for that kind of mitigation versus for regular operations? And the big data analytics, are we moving eventually, hopefully, to some predictive analytics? And if we can do the predictive analytics, can we dedicate a little bit of funding to potentially offensive operations for predictive analytics against some of these identified threats? And the InfraGard group has an event at the end of the month for the EMP Summit and the DuPont Summit. I'd like to invite you to those.
I can talk to the predictive analytics piece. We're using them in Kansas City right now to optimize our street maintenance. We figured out how to predict potholes. We know that a pothole forms 77 days after a significant freeze-thaw cycle, and we can tell where it's going to form based on the type of traffic and the amount of traffic that the sensors give us. So that's really kind of cool, and it's actually making our street maintenance budget about 40% more efficient. Right now we have about a $10 million a year problem, but we can only service about $4 million of that problem every year. So we've got to get some progress done in that particular area. So far as EMP goes, I will tell you I work with my Cisco partners on that, and I defer to them a lot, quite frankly.
Maybe one thing to add, from a technology perspective, cybersecurity is probably the #1 priority that we have at Oracle. Larry Ellison announced at Open World that it's become the #1 thing that he really cares about. After the Equifax hack, it was a really big deal, and we're building autonomous databases that use artificial intelligence to self-patch and self-heal, and we're doing the same thing on our applications, and we're working on our cloud capabilities. Everywhere we're doing cybersecurity, and Oracle is not the only company. I think cybersecurity is a really big deal for the technology companies, and our goal is to help all the different government levels to ensure that we are preventing and we are predictive to ensure that things don't happen. Because a lot of these threats are not happening from individuals. These are state-sponsored threats, so we need to make sure we stop them. A lot of our intelligence is moving digitally. Our IP is there, so we need to make sure we protect it. That's why we want to play a key role in making that safe.
Good morning, gentlemen. Appreciate it. My name is Michael Novak. I'm a consultant. I've been working on emerging technologies and how cities and municipalities can involve them in what they're trying to do. So I appreciate your conversation. When I think of infrastructure, of course, we think about the hardware, the telephone poles, utilities, cable, et cetera, et cetera. One area that I've been interested to hear more about, and we may talk about this with other panelists, is the use of voice for commerce and for citizenship if I need to report things or get information out of my municipality, whether it's, hey, what's the weather today? What's the potholes on my street? What's the traffic? All the way up to, gee, do I have to pay this to the business community, my taxes, all of my financials? So I'm curious what you've heard or what you've been thinking about in the embedded nature of voice within smart cities or smart infrastructure.
That's a great question about the role of citizens and their voices and how important is that participation there.
So if you think of voice, I mean, there's predictions by Gartner and Facebook and others that in the next 10 to 15 years, more than 50% of all internet traffic will come from voice. And if you're looking at the advances that Alexa is making and Cortana and Siri and others, I think they're getting very, very sophisticated, and we're using artificial intelligence and machine learning, be able to understand what people are asking, understanding the intent of those questions, and then be able to pass through neural networks, be able to pass that back to the systems that going to provide back the answers. And if you hear a futurist, they're talking that in the future, the internet is going to be ubiquitous. So all we have to do is just talk and we're going to get an answer and Google's going to give us an answer. I think that's where this is going with voice. I mean, obviously the infrastructure is not just the physical world. I think we need to change the mindset. The infrastructure is also a lot of these digital capabilities that we're going to all around us.
I think that is a...
Technologies that are trying to implement that.
Correct, yes.
Are there? Yes.
Yeah, yes.
We have voice-activated elements.
All right, well, I think that's a great note to end on. That's all the time we have today, but thank you to our panelists. And we'll have some closing remarks coming right up. Thank you.
Morning. On behalf of The Hill and our sponsor, ABB, I would like to thank all of you in the room and those of you who tuned in to the live stream. If you missed any portion of the discussion, the full event video will be available on thehill.com shortly. And as a reminder, please be sure to fill out your event feedback survey. You can hand your form to any member of the Hill staff on your way out. Thank you and have a wonderful day.